L'enseignement à domicile aura marqué le quotidien de millions de personnes. Les parents ont eu la lourde tâche d'enseigner à leurs enfants et tout cela s'est produit du jour au lendemain. Dans PHI Perspectives, nous observons des mentors autodidactes et voyons comment nous pouvons guider la prochaine génération à travers le déferlement de connaissances et d'informations sur nos écrans. Pour l'artiste Chumba, militante et fondatrice d'African Digital Art et Future Lab Africa, cela commence par la reconnaissance de la répartition inégale du savoir sur Internet.
This is the thing that actually makes my stomach hurt. And it's about basically what's happening, which is the system of knowledge, which continues to reflect this old colonial past and legacy, where knowledge is not evenly distributed. So when I read the call for this, when I read about this, the topic for today, I was like, oh, wow, I wish we had more problems like how do we preserve content? Because what happens is that there's not much content that's going on in terms of who has access to share online. It's all usually favors like very specific places on Earth. And it's a very scary map. It's the uneven coverage of Wikipedia. Like most Wikipedia entries come from a very specific place in the world. So most knowledge is coming from a very specific place in the world. And that should make us actually worry and stop congratulating ourselves for being innovators, because we are doing basically the same thing that we've always done. And we should really, really think about how we approach knowledge and how we approach the distribution of knowledge.
Une imagination limitée et l'incapacité d'imaginer d'autres futurs sont les conséquences directes de cette répartition inégale des connaissances, comme l'explique Chumba.
In 1981, this guy, Tom McPhail, spoke about electronic colonialism. He almost seemed prophetic about it. And he said that the world would experience a new concept of empire that wouldn't really necessarily be based so much on military power or land acquisition, but more on like psychological and mental imperialism. And digital colonialism is dangerous because what it inevitably leads to is the control and subjugation of our imaginations. So when we have all of these kind of problems happening online and the internet, and we're not having as wildly shared accessibility to knowledge, what happens is like we start limiting what we can actually think for the future. I used to think that imagination was, having the ability to think critically and creatively, but I've come to realize that imagination is actually much more powerful, because imagination is the most powerful thing that you could do because it generates a new reality. And so if our imagination is only limited within certain spaces and forgetting other parts of the world, then what kind of world are we imagining?
L'un des meilleurs chefs au monde est fondateur du Réfectorio, une initiative mondiale nourrissant les personnes dans le besoin en minimisant le gaspillage des restaurants. Massimo Bottura parle de l'échange de la culture comme force transformatrice pouvant entraîner un changement systémique de la répartition inégale des connaissances.
What we do in Osteria Francescana every day, we are creating it's a cultural experience. It is a laboratory of ideas. We couldn't make the Refettorio in Milan if we didn't have Osteria Francescana, because culture brings knowledge, knowledge open the consciousness, the sense of responsibility. We have a big painting right now close to a big photograph in the entrance of the restaurant. One photograph is an Elgar Essler and the Po River that overflowed. That's Emilia-Romagna. Why Emilia-Romagna is like this, is so fertile? Because the Po River was giving so much to the earth. On the other side, you have Bosco Tussauds. It's a big painting with black, monochrome, earthy, with all the crabs and the scraps. It's like a monk scream of the earth. The earth that is saying, help! We need help. Stop using chemic and otherwise I'm gonna die. And my guys are listening to this. And the young generation are open to listen to this. And that's why I'd say, we have to build the future generation close the chef, they have to know more about soil, and the farmers, they have to know more about flavors. Because, if they grow together, it's going to be more respect, one for the other. This is the future.
Au cours de cette conversation avec Michael Oliver Harding, Henry Rollins, une icône du punk rock, s'adresse à notre jeune public sur l'importance d'être multidisciplinaire et d'accumuler des connaissances partout où nous pouvons les trouver.
So for the young person in this very turbulent, interesting modern world, multitasking and being multi-talented, multi-platformed, I think is a very good way to go about it. Just being open, like, hey, you know how to build a website. Would you ever think about helping me edit some video content? Yeah, man, let me try that. And all of a sudden you have a new skill. And I think that's the new reality for a 19-year-old person going into this world, is like, I need to do A, B, C, and D, because there's probably not going to be a job at the bank. Like your dad and your dad's dad, it was like, show up to the mill, grind the thing, make the beer and the cheese or whatever. It's, I do this 20 hours a week. I'm filling in for a friend over here, and I'm kind of paying the rent. And that kind of person needs to be able to be dropped in any major city with a laptop and be able to be viable. It would be fascinating to be a young person right now in the Western world. I think it would be amazing, but you'd have to be far more skilled than I was when I was that age back in my day in the last century.
Comme le dit Henry Rollins, cette recherche de la connaissance ouvrira de nouvelles portes dans des endroits inattendus. Enfant, Henry Rollins a déménagé dans une communauté à ségrégation raciale où il était en contradiction avec sa culture. Sa recherche de la connaissance l'a amené à la seule chose capable de le définir en tant que personne, le punk rock.
So I get called cracker and Bama, which I've never understood. Whitey, I'm being pushed around for my skin color is terrifying. And I don't mean to be crass. I don't know if you've ever been unable to hold your bladder. You've been so scared. Whoosh, if it's ever happened to you, it's uncontrollable. And the kids would come up and go like this. I'd just piss my pants. I don't know how else to say it. I was so scared, trembling, because some kid has this fist up to my face. And like, the white boy's pissing. And then you just feel like you're mortified. You go back into school with your pants. You can't go home and change. And everyone's laughing. And when you're 7, that's like the end of your life. And that was racial tension in Washington. And I'd come crying to my mother, why does this boy like me? My mom had to make me understand civil rights and racism as a very little boy. And it makes you scared. Thankfully, I never harbored any racial sentiment because my mom schooled me right. But it was a tense place to grow up. And I went to a prep school as a kid where there are, these kind of rich kids out in the suburbs, and I was a middle-class kid from the city. And they didn't understand me. I didn't understand them. I was high on Ritalin because I'm a spaz. And so my grades were awful. It's a 13-mile, 20-mile schlep into the suburbs every day, into this sheetrock nightmare of mediocrity. And I go back to a city where they're throwing rocks at your head, trying to take your bike. And so that made me very angry and very confused. And so I had to figure out, what can I do? What am I good at? And apparently, as far as my father would tell me, nothing really. And as far as my teachers told me, nothing really. So I was very angry. And finally, with punk rock, my anger had focus. It had a backbeat. Joe Strummer informed me why I was angry. The Ramones taught me it's okay to be a loser and not get invited to the party because you can hang out with the Ramones. And I'll take that company any day. And so it was punk rock that said, I got people, I got a tribe, and my life has a soundtrack. And I realized I was an angry young man for myriad reasons. And then I started to focus it into writing and into work. Like, I'll give you 40 hours a week at this minimum wage place. Give me 60. And in 6 weeks, I'm going to run this place. Watch me. And the last boss I ever had was my boss at Haagen-Dazs, my ice cream job. And to this day, he still comes to my shows. And whenever I see Steve, who got me my first apartment, I was living in my car, he believed in me. Whenever I see him, I get all weepy.
Une fois que vous trouvez votre passion, restez avec elle. Soyez persistant et vous serez en mesure de faire ce que vous voulez, déclare Don Hahn, l'homme derrière Le Roi Lion et de nombreux classiques de Disney.
Even if you hate Walt Disney, it's inspiring about somebody who was persistent enough to find the money and the wherewithal to do whatever you wanted to do. And you learn that persistence is pretty much everything. You can do and you can accomplish anything, and not to sound corny, but you can really do almost anything if you're persistent enough about it. And so these 9 old men, as we call them, were his eyes and ears and hands in creating this, because he didn't draw and he didn't paint, and he was just a really interesting director. He was kind of a ham actor, and really interesting guy. So that show goes up in May. And what's been fun is, again, for selfish reasons, I've been able to go over to like Ward Kimball's family's house and Frank Thomas's son, Ted, and say, can I look through your garage and your boxes? And they're like pulling out these paintings and artwork. And these guys, and they weren't the only people at the studio, but they were so prolific. And it wasn't about animating. Mark Davis animated Cruella de Vil and Maleficent. And when he was done with that, he drove down to Disneyland and he designed the Haunted Mansion and he designed Pirates of the Caribbean. And we went home at night, he got out a sketchbook and sketched, and we had vacation. He traveled to New Guinea in the 40s and 50s when it wasn't easy to travel to New Guinea, and collected native Pacific Oceanic artwork.
And masks.
And masks, which lined the walls of his house.
So
and
beautiful.
He taught at Chennard Art Institute. I mean, these guys had huge lives. And if I learned one thing from them and many people I ran into at Disney who I adore, it's that working in the film industry, or in animation in particular, is about having a big life. And whatever you're doing and wherever you are in your career, you're not traveling enough. You're not reading enough stuff. You're not going to enough conferences. And it's not about going to animation conferences even. It's about these guys would take off and go, build locomotives in their backyard and travel to Europe and bring home boxes. And Walt went to Europe in 1935 and brought back 350 books in all these languages about fairy tales and art and architecture and that kind of thing. It's about photography, it's about drawing, it's about carrying a sketch pad wherever you go. So that idea of getting life experiences, how can you create the illusion of life unless you have a life? Yeah. So what I learned about these guys is just that. They had big lives.
C'était Don Hahn qui nous encourage à vivre une grande vie et à la partager avec le monde. Merci d'avoir écouté ce PHI Perspectives. Joignez-vous à nous pour notre prochain épisode où nous revisiterons les penseurs et créatifs pour comprendre ce à quoi, selon eux, demain ressemblera. Pour en savoir plus, visitez notre site web centre-phi.com.